You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of All Good Things, the Star Trek Universe podcast here on BQN and the Fandom Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mark, and with me today is Christos. Hey, Christos.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
I am good. I feel refreshed, invigorated, and not at all high like I was at the STLV dinner.
Honestly, what's funny, I when I edited last week's episode, and when I pitched that to you, you were at the end of the table at that dinner. You weren't sitting in, I guess in my quadrant, as we would say. So I had no idea that was going on. So when I just said, Mark, hey, tell us about the dinner, I totally meant that in all sincerity, not hey, let me throw it to Mark, who I know doesn't remember anything.
Well, I guess that means that I was passable when I was at the dinner.
Yeah, well,
I was passively conscious.
Well, we call that not being sloppy,
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah. I try my best when I'm in that state to keep it together. So I guess my years and years of drug use have paid off where I get away with it.
Yeah, right. What do they say that blazing does mean? If you stay high, nobody knows you're high.
There you go. Well, speaking of being high, with this one, you want to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah. I think as Amy and myself and you and whatnot, we're all excited and throwing out all the names of everybody who was at the network dinner. Somebody forgot to mention that our own Patreon, Paul Wright Jr., was there. So shout out to Paul. Always good seeing him. And by no means was that intentional.
No, absolutely not. And what the irony is that, each year that I've been to STLV, one of the most welcoming, warm people that I could meet is Paul. And he's one of the people I look forward to seeing the most at STLV. No kidding. I love seeing Paul. He's always so warm, friendly, personable, funny. And he's just a great guy. So the fact that he was omitted for the conversation is oh crap, because Paul's great. We love Paul.
Yeah. I think I have some pictures. We'll have to post them in the BQN to prove that Paul was there.
He was there.
He was there.
And we love you, Paul.
Yes.
Well, now it's time for All Good World.
From Las Vegas to Boston, USA to Canada and South America, from the United Kingdom to South Africa, from Russia to Australia, the South Pacific and beyond. This is All Good World.
Each episode, we highlight a different location around the globe where this podcast has reached. Today's episode, we'd love to give a special shout out to the Philippines. Now, the reason behind this shout out is that one of the stars of Star Trek Picard, actually two of them to be honest, Isa Briones and her father John, are also of Philippine descent and both had roles in Star Trek Picard. So Isa Briones, of course, played Daj/Soji, and her father John, I didn't get his character's name, but he was in season 2 of Star Trek Picard as
the first lady.
President's the first lady, the first husband. So, he had a very memorable performance, actually. He killed it. He was sinister in season 2, so really good job.
All right, Mabuhay.
Well, this week, we are going to be talking about, as part of our Taking It From the Top series, and I can't believe we're this far along, we don't have a theme, but at this point, we're going to be doing the final episodes if we do the first episodes. So maybe we'll have a jingle for that. But we're going to be talking about season 1, episode 1 of Star Trek Picard, and this is titled Remembrance. At the end of the 24th century, and 14 years after his retirement from Starfleet, Jean-Luc Picard, Sir Patrick Stewart, is living a quiet life on his vineyard, Chateau Picard, when he is sought out by a mysterious young woman, Daj, played by Isa Briones, in need of his help. He soon realizes she may have personal connections to his own past.
Yeah, it feels really appropriate, of course, to be doing this series only on series that have completed, so that we have the whole perspective of, the pilot versus the entire series. And I was going to say, it was quite jarring to go back and watch this pilot episode, if you would say, of Star Trek Picard, after having just spent, a lot of time in season 3. Because, man, it really highlighted to me what a different show this was when it started. I was watching this weekend on YouTube the Seventh Rule podcast with Eric Lofton and Ryan T. Husk, and they had Terry Matalas on, and they talked about Terry joining the show and Terry wanting to be on from the get-go, but only joining in season 2, only being able to tweak a little bit of season 2, but then really make the big changes in season 3. And it really is, it really started off, its origins were quite different. It was very much a Picard-centric show. It was a drama. It was just really, the one thing I will say is, like, it was such a great first episode. Like, I remember watching it like 4 times the week it aired several years ago. And, like, it's still, after watching it again, it's like, wow, it's a good episode.
So my question for you is, do you think we should do another Taking It From the Top with season 3 in the first episode? Because it is a different show.
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
I'm going to say yes, because when you take it from the top of season 3, the first thing we see is Dr., or should I say, I shouldn't say well, she's still a doctor. Dr. Beverly Crusher, yes. But I got to see that episode in a theater on its premiere, and that was also just a wow. Talk about, that one just felt so cinematic. So that's, I'd be totally down to include that, because it's like, they did make Picard to be like 3 different stories, 3 different chapters of a arc. That's like their own little things. Like, so you can take any season of Picard, but on its own, and just kind of run off and watch it. They're all have their own different feel and look and personality.
Yeah, they're not really. I mean, season 1 and 2 are more connected than season 2 and season 3, or season 1 and season 3.
Oh, I totally would agree with that.
But yes, so there's a few things we're going to cover today, as we do with the Taking It From the Top series. So if you guys have listened to the other ones, you'll know we're going to talk about the premise, we're going to talk about the characters, we're going to talk about the structure, and the hook and promise. These are what typically gets covered on these Taking It From the Top series. So the premise of the show, from this episode, do you have a sense of the premise? Like, is it going to be a drama, a comedy, procedural, what have you? What are the characters going to be dealing with, and what are the themes/messages? So, let's talk about that a little bit. From just looking at it as a premiere episode, having not seen any other parts of this show, Picard, going in blind, do you get a sense of what the premise is and who the characters are? What do you think?
That's a really good question, and I think it's kind of a twofold answer to this. I struggle to know or think that could anybody who's never seen Star Trek The Next Generation, the subsequent movies, et cetera, would they truly enjoy this show? Because I feel like I'm watching it and I'm like, you really need to rely on that backstory knowledge of who Picard is and what he's been through and who Data is and was and what, and that story. And even as they start to connect other things to it, bringing in like Agnes Girardi and they're referencing Bruce Maddox and whatnot. I feel like, how would this play to a complete stranger or somebody who's only like not intimately involved with Star Trek, but just casually, So
seen a couple of episodes,
right? Maybe. So I feel like this show is meant for a fan, at least season 1, I should say. It's really meant for a fan, because I feel like you would not enjoy this show so much if you didn't get the deep connection. Now, having said that, being that person who has all the background knowledge that is necessary to watch all the prerequisites, we should say, I love it, because you're just like, oh my God, this is like, we're picking up the story of Picard and who's this android, and oh my God, how is she part of Data? How's Data part of her? And and you're going into the Starfleet Museum archives or whatever, and you're looking at all Picard's stuff, and you're like, there's so many Easter eggs, and you bask in that. But, I don't think it was overdone. But, it's just like, I feel like the show just kicks off with this big mystery out of the gate. So it doesn't necessarily feel like a pilot. Maybe that's the best way to say that. It feels like a continuation of this guy's story.
Yeah, that's interesting take on it. I don't know if I watched it with that in mind when I saw it this time around. Maybe it's because I had seen the seasons 1, 2, and 3. But to me, it was kind of jarring and starkly different from season 3 and starkly different from, season 7 of TNG. And where we're talking about taking it from the top, and, we've covered all of the previous series inaugural episodes. I'm thinking about like the Deep Space Nine episodes, setting up who these characters were, what's going to be happening. Like, we didn't know, they didn't have any backstory. Like, we didn't know who Sisko was. We know O'Brien, but that's about it. But we got to know them in that first episode, all of the characters and sort of where they would be going, right? So it set it up so that episode 2 would sort of be whatever the show is going to be. Star Trek Picard didn't necessarily, for me, do that. In all the interviews and stuff leading up to, Patrick Stewart kept saying, this is not continuation of what we did on TNG. This is a completely different thing. It's a departure. We're not going to have the cast back together. We're not going to be on the ship, blah, 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 yada, yada. And then, bam, the opening shot is just the D, and there's Data. And it's like, what? Wait a minute.
Yeah.
But then he really isn't. I mean, he comes back and has some cameos in this season 1, but he isn't one of the main players, right? And the D isn't like the main ship. And Daj, who we see through this full episode, isn't in it after this episode. Like, who is in this episode after season 1? You know what I mean? I mean, Girardi's there.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it really, you meet Daj, we lose Daj, all in the same episode. We only get introduced to Soji at the very, very end of the episode. I guess we meet Laris and Siobhan, but, we don't know their story unless you had read the 3-part comic book series that introduced them ahead of the series, which we can get into the whole idea that you need all these other outside the show elements to kind of get what's going on in the show. You meet Picard again, who is a very, very, very changed man. He's gone from being last seen in Nemesis, I guess, as our strong leader, to a man who you're reminded at how old he is. I mean, in the scene where he has to run with Daj toward the end and he can't keep up because he's basically an old man. It's pretty like, oh, this is not our Picard. This is a hardened, bitter, I would say. I don't know, retired, as he says, I think at some point in the episode, I've been sitting here waiting to die, not living, It's not our Picard. So I think that opens up the mystery of what happened to get him there.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good segue into the character discussion. We can break down and talk about the characters. I appreciate you bringing up that quote because it's such a good quote. And Michael Chabon was the showrunner for season 1. And I think it was great. I mean, he's won a lot of writing awards and whatnot. And he wrote... Didn't he write... I think he wrote Wonder Boys, which is one of my favorite films. I love that film. And that was also a story about an older gentleman sort of coming into a different stage in his life and trying to figure things out. So that's kind of interesting. He's back to that. But yeah, so it is a very different Picard that we're meeting here. It's not TNG Picard. It's not Nemesis Picard. It's a very different Picard. And that we had to, as an audience, wrap our head around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, and like I said, I'll add on to that comment I made earlier. There's a 3-book comic book series and a novel called Last Best Hope, which really, I feel like you need them as a companion to understand the season of Picard that we got, season 1, and especially just kind of where the state of the Federation is, the state of the universe, state of the galaxy, the politics, and everything. And I read them, so that's great. I know all of it, but does it hurt, not knowing what happened to Picard in detail what you get in that novel. Does it hurt as a viewer? I'm not sure if you've read the novel or Mark, but the perspective, like you get the whole part of the Romulan relocation effort. You meet Rafi at length, and the fact that she served as his commander, and you really get to know Rafi and see her marriage kind of falling through the course of that book, and all the things that will eventually inform our season. Elnor, everything just comes out in that book.
But again, for this episode,
yeah, true.
None of them are in here. And what if you are coming to this blind, never seen any Star Trek at all? Who are the Romulans? Why should I care about this guy Picard? Like, he's rich, he's in a vineyard, but I thought they had no money, and this is Star Trek. Like, there's a whole bunch of things that I just feel like as an entry-level episode is a little weird.
Oh, yeah.
The choices are a little weird. Okay, Daj Soji. So here's one of the weird things. We have a character, Daj, which we start to care about through this and learn about her life, learn about, her family, her relationship with her mother, her relationship with her father, like all of these things. And then she gets Romulan acid on her, and then she's gone.
Yeah.
You're like, what?
Yeah, and how that explosion didn't kill Picard, that's the whole thing. I don't know, because he was that fragile.
Yeah.
Yeah, he gets blown back like 20, 30 feet. It's like, that would hurt, that would like kill us, let alone him.
Romulans, this is the first time we're seeing Laris and Zhaban.
Yep.
And we have two different style Romulans. We have the traditional with a weird forehead, and then we have the TOS Romulans that are normal.
Yeah, I mean, is it ever... Yeah, and of course, yes, we start to get introduced to the fact that Romulans look very different. You're from the North. I mean, we heard that a little bit like in episodes like Unification and whatnot, but it's really highlighted in here. Do they ever really get into, not in this episode, that they were ex-Tal Shiar?
Oh, not in this episode,
Okay,
but
later.
Yeah, I think maybe episode 2 or 3, while they're still part of the show. But again,
Yeah. Only like 3...
they're not after that.
They're only like in 3 episodes, and then like poor Zhaban, we never see him again. I mean, he just died.
No, and they don't really explain
He
it.
just died. No, they say he had a heart attack and died or something, but he died. Yeah, he's dead. So she's single when we meet her in season 2. But I think I remember that being like the big, everyone loved Laris from the get-go, especially in this first episode, and especially by the second and third when she really starts to help him and we get to see her kick some ass and whatnot. So, I mean, Laris and Zhaban are kind of throwaway characters in season 1. They're only there to serve their purpose, not necessarily be part of the show.
Same with the dog.
Yeah.
The dog is as much a character as Laris and Zhaban with this episode. And you think, oh, well, is the dog going to follow him on to his journeys throughout this whole season? Is he going to be a big part of it? They seem close. They have this relationship. But,
Well, speaking of the dog, I think it's just a little awkward, the scene where Picard is talking to the dog in French. It's like we're trying to go back and kind of address the fact that Picard was supposed
the elephant in the room.
The elephant in the room, that he was supposed to be a Frenchman. He has this big British accent, and we never really heard. I mean, there might have been a line or two here or there in French, but mostly it never really made sense that he wasn't cast as just an Englishman and not a Frenchman, as they should. So I feel like this scene is meant to be like, oh yeah, look, see, he speaks French. He's French. Blah blah blah. You know what I mean? And it's like it's just weird.
Amen to that. But I did snicker and smile whenever he speaks in French. I'm just like, oh, that's cute. Picard's speaking in French.
Yeah. Jumping to Agnes, I actually liked Agnes in this episode. It was before she really got weird, And Agnes definitely has her journey between season 1 and 2. In fact, I loved her in season 2. I really didn't like her in season 1. But going back, okay, she was all right in episode 1. I think you don't get into the insecurities and all the other things. And of course, she hasn't been brainwashed yet by Commodore O. So I guess there's
more to come.
More to come. Jump to episode 3 or 4. But yeah, I mean, Agnes is actually pretty cool in this episode, and she does help fill in the gap and move the story and help Picard to figure out who these girls possibly are and how they could be. And then, of course, we get she pulls in the very much the big Bruce Maddox tie-in, which talk about TNG deep cuts, bringing back a character that we only saw on screen in one episode and was referenced in a few others. But it's pretty deep cut, like I said. But we like Agnes in this episode.
And she brought in B4, which, again, if you've never seen Star Trek...
Right? And
who's this android that I'm supposed to care about in the drawer?
And something else I caught in that exchange was that, of course, having seen Nemesis, we all know that Data plugs himself into B4, and we have the big download of Data into B4. But they mentioned that was lost, like somehow that cascaded out, or it didn't hold. So Data is not necessarily sitting in B4 anymore. And I guess maybe that was just a detail that I glossed over in my many watches of episode 1, he's not really in there anymore.
Yeah. But then somehow it's a part of him in season 3. But anyway, again, it was like a big reset button season after season with this show.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I wish that Terry would have been involved from the beginning, because I'm sure season 1, 2, and 3 would have been so much more cohesive and better.
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah. It's like, for me, the 3 seasons of Picard are like good, better, best. I don't hate season 2. A lot of people are much more conflicted on season 2 than season 1. Season 2, you either love it or you hate it. That's pretty much everyone's approach to it.
Season 2 for me had a banger of a start and a banger of a finish, but what got muddled in between is the fact that they spent 6 episodes or 8 episodes
on Earth
in our time. That was a little long in the tooth.
Yeah. Episode 1, I would also argue episodes 1 and 2 were very strong. That whole Confederation episode it's very interesting. In fact, I would have loved us to spend a little more, maybe a second episode in the Confederation would have made a little bit more sense. But anyways, we're here to talk about episode 1. So
Narek we see briefly at the end. We don't know who he is, but we know he's like a Romulan kind of space twink. I know a lot of people had a crush on him. And he is crushing on Soji. Or
he's supposed to be, he's faking, but we don't know that yet. But obviously he's a Romulan. Yeah, with Narek, one thing about him that was always a little jarring to me is, these villains, it's always the guy with, the British accent or whatever that's the villain, and it's like, really? I mean, it's funny always talking to our good friends like Kelvin and whatnot and get their take on why American shows do that all the time, to cast foreign people as the villains. But it's like, it's a trope that is so exhausted that I wish they'd just move on.
What is it? Star Wars, all of the Empire people are always British.
To be fair, most of that movie was shot in Pinewood Studios in England. So they were hiring British actors, but yeah. And then the other big, I guess, character we don't talk about is this big reveal of the Borg cube at the end of the episode, and it's like, oh wow. There's another big throwback to you need some prior knowledge of what that signifies, otherwise it's like, oh, it's just a cube. But they're playing the Borg music, dun, dun, dun. It's like as a fan, I'm here for it. But if I were trying to get a new person in Star Trek, I would never recommend this show. I would never recommend this show.
No. I don't either.
I'm like, go watch Strange New Worlds.
yeah, pretty much. But as somebody that had seen all of TNG and all the movies, when the cube comes on, I'm like, oh my god, it's a Borg cube! And I flipped out. It's like crazy. But if you've never seen the show, and you're not gonna know.
I was convinced that season 1 was a big ripoff of Star Trek Online, because there's a big story in Star Trek Online where the Romulans have captured a Borg cube and they're mining it for technology and enhancing their fleets and things like that. So and Sela showed up in that. So I was half expecting in the Star Trek Online games, I was half expecting us to get, I thought they were just taking inspiration from that. But other than the Borg cube being a research place, that was where the similarities stopped.
Yeah, it would have been cool to get CeeLo, though.
Oh, yeah. Somewhere in the whole grand 3 seasons, there was so much Romulan stuff in the 3 years. Well, maybe not as much in the last year, but that would have been a great way to bring Denise Crosby back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about the structure a little bit. So, the structure of this episode, is it going to continue? Like, will there be voiceovers, flashbacks, narration? Will their perspective remain with the main protagonist or float between other characters? So, in this first episode alone, if we're looking at, we don't know. But we know in this one, there's plenty of flashbacks
or dream sequences,
things like that.
Yeah, same thing. I guess it's the same mechanism. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Yeah, right back to the thing we've kind of brought up a few times. It's like you really have to have this vast knowledge, especially to understand the flashbacks and the dream sequences or whatever. And like, who is this Data guy and why is he so important to Picard? If you had not watched TNG or the movies, you would not know this.
They did show clips also from the Short Treks episode Children of Mars, which I'm wondering if the Children of Mars episode used actually clips of this, even though it came out beforehand.
Yeah.
Who knows? But yeah, the attack on Mars was used right at the beginning. And so it has tied those two things together. But I will say that you don't need to have seen Children of Mars in order to have, appreciated that scene in this episode.
Yeah, I feel like that is a little bit. I mean, there's a couple episodes down the road where they show the Mars attack in more detail. I feel like that episode informs that better. I do remember seeing Children of Mars during that fall of 2019 season of dropping Short Treks and getting really excited because you actually see Picard on a screen in that Children of Mars, and it's like, it's the first time we've seen Picard in, at that point, 17 or 18 years. The Short Trek is powerful. It is kind of another prequel to this show. Once again, like I said, we have a 3-part comic book, a novel, and a Short Trek that are all precursors to this show that if one were to be coming in fully informed, you need to watch. You would have checked that out. Yeah. Interesting. One other thing I will make, as we're talking structure, I guess, and maybe I didn't notice as much at the time, I felt like showing technology in this episode was really strong. I mean, the way that, like, Laris is watching a TV screen in the kitchen, the way that when Picard goes and unboxes the painting, it's just like this little device that can morph itself around the painting and actually produces the right oxygen levels and everything to preserve the painting. There's just really cool uses of technology, especially since we're in the chateau quite a bit of the episode, and it's very, very ancient in that respect. It's a long-standing building. But you would see how people in the 24th, 25th century would be able to, I think this is $23.99 in this episode to be, $24.99. Yes. Yeah.
It's on sale.
Yeah. $24.99. Anyways, yeah, it's pretty, it's very, very cool the way they show how people are using technology and modern conveniences, but still kind of living in a traditional environment. But you have everything you need there that makes your life easier. And I think that was just a good way. Like there's some money was spent there, so it doesn't just look like some throwaway of we're shooting in Temecula to save some money.
Yeah. The lady, I'm thinking about the lady putting on the makeup too, the interviewer lady.
Yeah. Oh.
They just waved this wand and all of a sudden her makeup changed.
Yes, that's it. Exactly. That was another one I noticed too. It's like, yeah. And then there were other things like traditional lighting stuff that you're like, really? You would just think that with whatever video camera you're using, it would just compensate the light, the same way our phones do now, which is kind of crazy, take a video in the dark and suddenly it looks great,
Yeah.
So
I like the use of the lady that was walking through the archives, who was a hologram, and she was a little bit snooty, but also like trying to play with humor a little bit. It was reminiscent of the Doctor, and I love that they did that.
Yeah, and it's almost like it leads you to wonder, or like, after the Doctor returned from the Delta Quadrant, did his programming lead to further development of holograms and whatnot. I mean, that's a little headcanon we can tell ourselves, right? You know, that you know, how he evolved for running for so many years. And that's addressed in a few episodes of Voyager toward the end, that he became more sentient in that respect. And maybe I think you see that. I totally get your point. That hologram totally gave me Doctor vibes.
Yeah, they got a good actress to play the hologram.
Yes.
Yeah. So, hook and premise. Okay. Leave some storylines open to be continued. Let your story be messy a bit longer. Give them satisfaction/closing with the promise that you're leading them to better stories /themes. What did we think about this episode as far as the hook and the promise?
Oh, I think it's strong. Well, like I said, as long as you're coming in with the premise that you're a fan. Okay, so we need to you need to accept that, I guess. We know enough about some of the people and at least the history and the storyline that we're like, holy crap. And this is a 10-episode story. It's very serialized. Yeah, it's very much that 10-part story, and this is only part 1. And part 1 needs to get you interested, and it needs you to want to binge right into episode 2 specifically. And I think that's, you know, some of the good and bad things about Picard. It is definitely binge television, not weekly. So anybody who's starting it now gets the benefit of being able to binge it. So yes, there's a lot of big stories, a lot of questions by the end. You know, what are these Romulans? Why do they want her? What's the deal with synths? What happened on Mars? What is the Borg cube? And what is it? Why do they have this Borg cube? How do they have this Borg cube? And by the way, I don't think that it's ever explained in the course of 10 episodes. It just kind of stopped working one day and they found it. I don't know.
Well, wasn't it because of the crazy lady there, Ramda?
Oh.
That she broke the cube? They tried to simulate the cube with Romulans.
Yes.
That Borg cube tried to assimilate a Romulan ship, and they became messed up.
They got the Jat Vache. They got that imagery that kind of
because
set,
of the admonition.
The one that sent Agnes kind of nuts. Yeah, I guess I take that back. It is later, why they had the Borg cube was later explained. But yeah, there's just lots of questions. And of course, that's not really answered in this episode. So that's question marks. And
is anything answered in this episode? I feel like there's no closure in this episode. It just sort of ends.
Well, we start to figure out, the one thing is, in the beginning, you don't know who Soji or Daj is, or I should say Daj, but through the episode, we figure out that she's an android and that she was created using a piece of data and whatnot. So there's some development of the story or answers, enough that you're getting more pieces and you want to keep going. So it's not left. I would say that's the biggest answer that we get in the first episode, and we're not left hanging.
Oh, as far as Soji/Daj's backstory.
Yeah, we start to get pieces of, okay, so they're not humans, they're androids, and we figure out that it must have been Maddox who created them, and using, some neurons from data. So there are some answers, but they only lead to more questions. So, and that's what the story should do. By getting some answers, the audience's appetite is satisfied, but more questions arise and you want to keep going.
The pacing for me was a little weird with this episode. And actually the first half of season 1, to jump ahead a little bit, it's like sort of a slow burn and starts picking up, 3 or 4 episodes in.
Yeah.
And by mid-season, it's like, okay, we're starting to cook here. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because, again, going back to season 3, which is its own thing, at that point, they're hitting the beats, ba-dum, 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 through the course of the whole first season.
Yeah, I feel like...
third season.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, they don't even get to space until the end of the 3rd episode. So, talk about slow burn. And people, I get it. They said from the beginning that this was not going to be Star Trek The Next Generation or a continuation of, But, it's Star Trek, so we expect to get to space at some point, right? And be on ships or starships and see all that. So it is a little bit of a slow burn, but, ultimately it's not a bad episode. It definitely, as a pilot goes, with the caveat that you must be a Star Trek fan that knows the history behind these characters and that universe. If you accept that, it's a very good pilot.
I think, this is a good spot because we're already kind of in final thoughts to pivot to final thoughts. And my question is, how well does this do setting up the whole series of what Star Trek Picard would be and getting people hooked to watch it as a first episode of a series? How well does that do as somebody that's coming in blind, not knowing Star Trek?
I think it's a massive failure if you say it like that. I think instead Star Trek, that's part of the downside of having 57 years of Star Trek is you can't, and especially trying to keep everything in canon, as they would say. If you're going to pick up somebody who's already had, 180 episodes of TNG, roughly, 4 feature films, and then obviously if you just throw in the whole Berman universe of DS9, Voyager, and TNG, and the continuation of that timeline, then you're like, how can you not reference it? So this is where Star Trek kind of hurts itself, and we want this, right, the fans, but when you're a franchise that's looking to expand and add new fans, when we solved that problem, they totally made Strange New Worlds that show that's a good entry point, but still references what's come before and what's to come after. But Picard, it's just I feel like if I just took one of my friends who's not really into Star Trek, even if he was only casually aware of it and said, watch this, I feel like I'd be pausing it and explaining everything. And that's not the experience you want, right? But
for you, personally, when you watched it, you said you watched it a bunch of times.
Oh, yeah. I was so excited. Cut to the, January 2020, which when this aired. And, I think I watched the first episode, 4 or 5 times in the first week before I even got to episode 2.
Yeah.
Because I was that excited. It was that good. I mean, we had such high hopes for Picard. I think if you set the stage at being at STLV in August 2018, when they came out and Patrick Stewart came out, and we knew what he was going to do because the rumors of Picard had been swirling all summer. But when Patrick Stewart came out and announced we would be getting Jean-Luc back and he was going to be different, we knew that from the minute they announced the show. We were excited. And then, a year later, there was, I believe, a San Diego Comic-Con and a STLV trailers that were dropped and maybe a scene, I don't know. Then we start to find out about Data, and then 7 of 9 is going to be in this show, and we're all losing our shit, and we're ready for Picard. So by the time it finally got there, episode 1 hit, and it hit well. That's how I remember it. And honestly, upon rewatch today, it's still a really good episode of Star Trek. I got really excited, and I can almost tell you, Mark, that I'll probably be continuing on a Picard rewatch. In fact,
cool.
It's August 27th, and I think September 4th or 5th is the season 3 DVD Blu-ray. So maybe in the next week I can get through the other 19 episodes of season 1 and 2, be ready for that Blu-ray. And it's like when you tell people to rewatch Star Trek Picard, it's only 30 episodes, so it's not the biggest task. You can watch 1 episode a day and be done in a month.
Yeah.
But I feel like the episode holds up really well. Here we are 3.5 years later, having now seen the arc of the 30 episodes. Like you said, in a future episode, we could always discuss season 1 versus season 3. I feel like you really do have to watch Picard and think of it as, 3 different anthology series.
Yeah, so that's what particularly I think we'll only get this kind of discussion from this show. I don't think we could say that about some of the other shows where they're distinctly different season to season. That's a unique thing to Picard. I mean, maybe a little bit with Discovery, but yeah, that's what kind of makes this discussion pretty interesting. And I'm glad I was able to get a couple of different takes there as far as how it did as a inaugural episode, because there is this duality to it that there might not be with some of the other shows, right? And so from my final thoughts, I feel the same way. Looking at it as an entry point to Star Trek, an entry point into this universe, I gotta say it's probably not the best. This is not what I would recommend to people. But once you get into the pond and you're swimming around and checking out all the different shows, and you have a little bit more knowledge there, maybe like you've read the books, maybe you're into that, or played some of the video games and say, oh, this is kind of cool. I want to know more about this world. Once you're in that place, and then you come to Star Trek Picard, you can appreciate all the little things and really enjoy it. But yeah, this isn't something I'd recommend, and I don't think it does a good job setting up what the show would become, because most of the people that are in the show through the series aren't in this episode or featured much. But with my knowledge of Star Trek, with seeing all of it, going into this, like yourself, I was extremely excited. Loved this first season. I remember when it came out at STLV that Picard was going to be coming back. There was a good friend of mine. His name was Chuck, and Chuck and I used to watch Star Trek Enterprise together as it aired. I'd be hanging out with him, and we would watch all the episodes and really loved it. We'd always skip the intro, and he was so excited. And regretfully, there was sadly there was an accident that had happened, and Chuck did not make it to be able to see the premiere.
Oh,
but I thought about my friend Chuck every episode of that first season. Every time it came on, I was watching it for him. I was watching it with him wherever he was, and so I'll always remember that and how excited I was for it, and thinking about my friend and all the good times we had watching Star Trek together. And it is generational. It does connect people, and it's something that will always be special for me. Whenever a new Star Trek series comes out, I'll always be really excited. This one in particular, like I said, for my friend Chuck, I'll always have that memory to connect it with too. So
that's very nice.
Yeah, so I do love season 1. Critical of it as an entry point, but if you throw that out the window, it's a great show.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny. Like you said, I feel so strongly about it, but like I said, maybe next time we talk episode, if we do this rundown for the season 3 premiere, what we can leave it with this as a question. If season 3 had been season 1, how much different would that have been? And I almost think that would have been pretty cool to have season 3 be season 1, and had 2 more years to follow. And even if you only use the entire TNG cast for season 1, and maybe you only use some of them for the later seasons here and there, or maybe all of them at different times, but but like that would have been, we basically would have been kicking off Star Trek Legacy-ish and having that been in there. But that's another like, maybe that would be a good what if episode for us. What if season 3 was season 1? Question mark.
What shows are on BQN, you ask? Well, here's a rundown of some podcasts you might be interested in. All Good Things, a Star Trek Universe podcast covering all of Trek, hosted by Amy, Mark, Christos, and Kelvin. Bargain Bin Gamer, a YouTube show hosted by Davey, a self-proclaimed gamer who specializes in reviewing and showcasing affordable video games. If you're lost in the Delta Quadrant, check out The Captain's Couch, a Star Trek Voyager podcast hosted by Jeremiah sitting on Janeway's Ready Room couch. Cinema Z, a film discussion and review podcast showcasing films you probably missed but should definitely check out, hosted by Mark, Matt, and Laz. Beam aboard the Galaxy Class, a Star Trek Next Generation podcast covering all of TNG, hosted by Amy, Joe, Rhea, and Kevin. History with the Zilagis, a snippet of historical events from around the world, hosted by Chrissy and Jason. For the newest Trek coverage, check out Infinite Diversity, hosted by Chrissy and Thad. Test your Trek knowledge with Trexperts Quiz, a Star Trek quiz show hosted and written by Davey. Union Federation, covering all things Star Trek and the Orville, which we all know is really a Star Trek show, hosted by Kyle, Kevin, Amy, and Haley. Spill the Tea with What's the Tea, Bev, a Trek current events and fan interview show hosted by Christos. And for our Patreon members, we have The Hive Mind, BQN's monthly roundtable discussion with hosts and listeners. It's Green, a cornucopia of topics hosted by Mark. And Amy's Math Moments, a quick look at math moments in Star Trek, hosted by Amy. We know you have a choice of podcasts to choose from, and we thank you for listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Hey, Christos, what are we going to talk about next week?
I think we're taking on we're continuing part 5 of our Possessed series with Lower Decks, Strange Energies.
What was that about?
You know, I think I know what episode this is, but I'm definitely going to need to rewatch it, which is totally cool because we are quickly approaching the premiere of season 4 of Lower Decks, so getting to do anytime I get to rewatch an episode of Lower Decks, it's really, it's a good way to get excited about it coming back. Another one that, with Lower Decks, we only have at this point 30 episodes, about to have 40, but 30, and they're like, of course they're 22, 23 minute episodes or 25, whatever, but they're even shorter. So, in my mind, in my headcanon, there's a lot more episodes of Lower Decks than.
But they pack them in.
They pack them in. You know what it is? Because there's just so much in an episode. You almost have to watch an episode 3 times to get everything, and you
all the references.
And my saving grace has been turning on the subtitles because you get they talk so fast in Lower Decks that you don't always hear it. It's like when I watch Ab Fab, Absolutely Fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
The humor, it's British humor, and they talk super fast and the different accent and everything that you're like, I missed half of it, but I still think it's funny. But when you watch it over again and again, you get more and more out of it. So Lower Deck Strange Energies, folks, that's what's up next. Do your homework.
Well, sweetie. We would love to hear what you thought of today's episode. And join our Facebook group, the BQN Collective, to continue the discussion there. You can also tweet your thoughts at AllGoodPod. Please follow the network on Twitter/X, Blue Sky, and Instagram at BQN Podcast. We've also partnered with our friends at the Fandom Podcast Network, where you can find us by searching their master feed. And Christos, where can people find you when you are not uncovering murder plots?
You can find me on Facebook in the BQN Collective. You can find me on X, Instagram, and now Blue Sky. I need to finish setting up my profile, by the way. Thank you for the key to that. At Greek Geek SD. And you can find me also on the network hosting What's the Tea, Bev, which will be back again very soon. Folks, I have been planning a conference for work that is about to go down in 2 weeks in Palm Springs. And when that conference finally happens, I get a lot of my life back. So, but What's the Tea, Bev? I know we only did about 4 or 5 episodes this summer, but my plans are that it'll be a much, much regular podcast come the fall. So look forward to that. And Mark, where can people find you when you're not having android neurons inserted into your head?
Oh, that'd be great. Man, if I could... if I could just have another, like an Android brain that could just hold my memories for when I am high, I could be like, okay, accessing. Maybe slower, but it would access.
Like that thought or that idea that you had when you were high that made total sense,
yes.
But you cannot recollect when you come down.
Yes. Well, when I'm not doing that, you can find me, of course, in the BQN Collective Facebook page. You can find me on Blue Sky at MW207. And, well, you can listen to my show, Cinema Z. And we discuss some of our favorite films. We have cocktails. We reenact scenes from the movie. And it's completely ridiculous. And, yeah, I hope that some of our listeners will tune in. We do occasionally make Star Trek references, although it is not a Star Trek pod. But I think that, if you're listening in your car in the morning, you want to listen to something funny, it's another good show to check out.
Nice.
Please hit the subscribe button on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a star rating and written review. It helps others to find the show. You can also find the entire network's podcast with our master feed by searching BQN.
At this time, we'd like to thank our associate producers, Mahedran Radhakrishnan and Tim Cooper. And special thanks to Graham Kelly for our opening and closing music, and to our very own Mark White for our artwork each and every week. And listeners, do know that Mark really does spend a lot of time on that artwork, and in many times, he presents anywhere from 4 to 6 options to the other hosts and says, pick one. And it's kind of funny because rarely do us hosts agree on which one is the best, and then it gets even more complicated.
That's why ranked choice voting is good.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah,
1, 2, or 3 in which order?
Yeah. Seems more democratic. Okay. If you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. We'll add you to the Hive Mind Facebook group so you can enjoy It's Green, Amy's Math Moments, and other network perks. With a monthly subscription of $5 or more, you can join our meetings on the Hive Mind Roundtable discussion on the second Saturday of each month. Visit patreon.com/BQN to get all the details and watch your messages. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us as we continue to search out
all good things.